Neighbors are supposed to be the people you can count on, the friendly faces you see every day, the ones who wave at you from across the street. But what if the person living right next to you was hiding something dark? What if the friendly smile concealed something sinister? Some neighbors bring cookies when you move in. Others bring nightmares. These are 5 true creepy neighbor horror stories that will make you double-check your locks tonight. I was 9 years old when my family moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood in 2008. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, kids played in the streets until the street lights flickered on, and the biggest problem anyone had was keeping their lawns trimmed. To my young mind, it felt safe, until I noticed Mr. Wilkins. He lived in the house directly across from ours, an older man in his 70s who always seemed to be watching. Every time I stepped outside, whether to play, ride my bike, or simply grab the mail, I'd glance up and see him in his second-story window. He never waved, never smiled. He just stared, his wrinkled face pressed against the glass, unmoving. At first, I thought he was just a grumpy old man with nothing better to do. But then I started noticing things that didn't make sense. No one ever visited him. There were no signs of family, no friends stopping by. His car sat in the driveway, untouched, collecting dust. But the strangest thing of all, every night at exactly 3 a.m., the light in his upstairs window would flicker on and off. It wasn't a steady flicker like a broken bulb. It was deliberate, a pattern, a signal. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. One night, curiosity got the best of me, and I mentioned it to my dad. He laughed, shaking his head. "He's probably just lonely, kid. Don't let it creep you out." But that didn't stop the uneasy feeling that settled deep in my chest every time I saw that window. Then came the night that changed everything. It was storming outside, the kind of rain that lashes against the windows and makes the trees bend like they're about to snap. I had trouble sleeping, so I went downstairs for a glass of water. As I passed by the living room window, my gaze flicked up, straight to Mr. Wilkins's house. And that's when I saw him. Only, he wasn't alone. There was another figure standing behind him, tall, shadowy, unmoving. My body locked up. My mind raced for an explanation, but nothing made sense. Mr. Wilkins had never acknowledged me before, never reacted to my presence. But now, he lifted his hand and pointed, right at me. My stomach twisted in terror. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my glass, and sprinted upstairs, pulling the covers over my head like a little kid. I barely slept, my heart hammering in my chest, until the sun finally peeked through my window. The next morning, I told my parents everything. My dad's face darkened, his amusement from before completely gone. He agreed to check on Mr. Wilkins. We walked across the street and knocked on the door. No answer. We knocked again. Still nothing. My dad tried the doorknob, but it was locked. I felt a strange sense of dread creeping up my spine. Something was wrong. A few days later, the police arrived after a concerned neighbor reported a horrible smell coming from the house. They broke down the door and found Mr. Wilkins sitting in his chair in the upstairs room, dead. And not just recently. The coroner said he had been dead for over a week. I felt sick. My parents were horrified, but one question kept repeating over and over in my mind, making my skin crawl with fear. If he had been dead that whole time, then who was the person in the window? When I moved into my first apartment in 2017, I was thrilled. It was a small but cozy space, perfect for living alone. The building was quiet, the rent was reasonable, and my only neighbor was a woman named Carol, who lived in the apartment next to mine. She was in her 50s, friendly but reserved, the kind of person who preferred keeping to herself. Everything felt normal, at least at first. The first few weeks went by smoothly. I settled into my new routine, enjoying the peace of having my own space. But then, something strange started happening. At night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I would hear whispers. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just Carol watching TV or talking on the phone. But the whispers weren't coming from her apartment. They were coming from inside the walls. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the pipes or the wind outside. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became that these whispers weren't random noises. They were words, faint, raspy, almost human. I couldn't make out what was being said, but the voices were there, just beyond the thin drywall, murmuring softly in the dark. One night, as I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the noises, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper, clearer than ever before. It said my name. "Come closer." I shot up in bed, my chest tightening with fear. My heart pounded as I reached for my bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. Nothing. There was nothing there. But I knew what I had heard. Something had spoken to me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, exhausted but determined to find an explanation, I ran into Carol in the hallway. She must have noticed how pale I looked because she frowned and asked if I was okay. I hesitated, then mentioned the whispers, expecting her to laugh or tell me it was just the building settling. Instead, her face went pale. "You hear them too?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. A shiver ran down my spine. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone in this. Carol quickly glanced around as if afraid someone or something was listening. Then, in a hushed voice, she told me about the previous tenant in my apartment, a man who had vanished without a trace. He had lived there for years, mostly keeping to himself. Then one night he was just gone. No sign of forced entry, no goodbye letter, nothing. The police had searched his apartment for clues, but there was something unusual about it. It had been completely soundproofed. I stared at her, my skin crawling. If the walls were soundproof, then how was I hearing whispers? That night, I did everything I could to block out the noises. I stuffed my ears with earplugs, turned on white noise, and even slept with the TV on. But at exactly 3 a.m., something happened that no amount of noise could drown out. My bedroom door slowly creaked open. I hadn't locked it, but I knew I had closed it before bed. The apartment was small. There was nowhere for anyone to hide, and yet, as I lay there, frozen in fear, I felt it. A presence, something unseen standing in the darkness, watching me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. A week later, I moved out. To this day, I don't know what I heard in those walls, and honestly, I don't think I want to. I was born in this house. I grew up playing in its backyard, running through its hallways and watching the seasons change from its windows. For 30 years, this had been my home. It was familiar, safe, and ordinary. Or at least, I thought it was. For as long as I could remember, our next-door neighbor, Mr. Lee, had lived alone. He was an older man, well into his 60s, with graying hair and a quiet personality. He wasn't the overly friendly type, but he was polite, always offering a small wave when he saw me outside. His house was simple, a bit outdated, but well-maintained. There was nothing strange about it except for one thing, his basement window. The small rectangular window sat just above ground level, facing our backyard. Most of the time, it was completely dark, almost like no one ever used the basement. But every now and then, usually late at night, I would see a dim, flickering light inside. It never lasted long, just a few seconds before everything went dark again. I had noticed this pattern since I was a kid, but I never thought much of it. Maybe it was just an old light bulb or some kind of electrical issue. One evening, as I was locking up for the night, I happened to glance out my back window. Something moved behind the glass. A shadow. It was quick, just a brief flicker of motion, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I shook it off, convincing myself it was nothing. But a few nights later, it happened again. This time, I stood still, watching carefully. The basement light flickered on, and a shape passed by the window. It wasn't clear, just the outline of someone, moving inside. I told myself it was Mr. Lee, maybe looking for something in storage. But something about the movement felt off. It was slow, hesitant, almost fearful. The feeling gnawed at me for days. Finally, I decided to ask Mr. Lee about it. One afternoon, as he stood outside watering his plants, I casually brought it up. "Hey, Mr. Lee, do you use your basement much? I think I saw a light on down there the other night." His reaction was instant. His hand froze. The water from the hose spilled over the ground as his grip tightened. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. Then, just as quickly, he forced a smile and shrugged. "Oh, that old place? Nah, just a bunch of junk down there. Must have been my flashlight. I was looking for something the other night." I nodded, but something in his voice didn't sit right with me. It was too rushed, too eager to dismiss the topic. And his smile, it wasn't a real smile. It was strained, like he was trying too hard to act normal. That night I couldn't stop thinking about it. So at midnight I sat in the dark by my window, watching. At 12:14 a.m., the basement light flickered on. My pulse quickened. Then, as I stared at the window, something happened that made my stomach drop. A hand appeared against the glass. It was thin, bony, and shaking. The fingers pressed desperately against the surface, as if trying to push through. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't Mr. Lee's hand. It was too small, too fragile. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The light went out, plunging the basement back into darkness. Panic surged through me. I knew what I had just seen. Someone was in that basement, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my hands trembling. When the officers arrived, they knocked on Mr. Lee's door. He took his time answering, and when he finally did, he looked calm, too calm. He played innocent, claiming he had no idea why they were there. But when they asked to check his basement, something in his face changed. It was just for a second, a flicker of hesitation, but I saw it. He knew. After a long pause, he stepped aside and let them in. I stood outside, watching, my heart pounding. Minutes passed, then suddenly, a shout. One of the officers rushed up the stairs, calling for backup. And then they brought her out, a young woman. She looked weak, terrified. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her face pale from being locked away for so long. She clung to the officer as they led her outside, her body shaking. She had been missing for over 2 years. Mr. Lee was arrested that night. As they took him away, he barely reacted. He didn't fight, didn't beg. He just watched. His expression was blank, emotionless. For days, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to the same terrifying thought. Mr. Lee had lived there for over 30 years. How many others had there been? Back in 2011, I lived in a quiet apartment complex. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was safe and affordable, exactly what I needed at the time. Most of the tenants were friendly enough, exchanging nods or small talk in the hallways. But there was one person who stood out. Mark, my neighbor. Mark was different. He never spoke to anyone, never had visitors, and never seemed to leave his apartment except to stand on his small balcony. He would just stand there, staring out at the street below, not watching the cars, not enjoying the view, just staring. His blank expression, his rigid posture, It always gave me an unsettling feeling. But I figured he was just a loner, someone who preferred to keep to himself. One night I got home late from work. The hallway was dimly lit, the air still and quiet. As I passed by Mark's apartment, something caught my eye. His front door was slightly open. A sliver of warm light spilled into the hallway. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the door. Mark was never the kind of guy to leave his door open. In fact, I wasn't even sure he ever left his apartment. Something felt off. I hesitated, but decided to knock. No response. I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. The silence from inside felt unnatural, almost heavy. My gut told me to just walk away, but my curiosity got the better of me. I leaned in slightly, trying to see through the gap. The apartment was lit, but it was completely silent. No TV, no movement, just an eerie stillness. Then, before I could react, a hand. Pale, thin, and bony. It shot out from the darkness inside and grabbed the door, yanking it shut in one swift motion. The force of it sent a gust of air rushing past me. I stumbled backward, my heart slamming against my ribs. Whoever, or whatever, had been inside didn't want me looking in. I stood there, frozen for a few seconds, waiting to hear something. A voice, a shuffle, anything. But there was nothing, just the closed door in front of me. The hallway felt colder now, like something was watching me. I didn't wait around to find out what. I rushed back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. The next day, I kept an eye out for Mark, but he never appeared. His balcony, once occupied every evening, remained empty. Days passed, then weeks. No one saw him come or go. The only sign that something had changed was the complete and utter silence coming from his apartment. Then, about a month later, the apartment was suddenly rented out to someone new. No mention of Mark. No moving trucks. It was as if he had never existed. But every now and then when I walk past that building, I glance up at his old balcony. And sometimes, just for a second, I swear I see a figure standing there, staring. There was a house on my street that always stood out. It wasn't abandoned, it was well kept, freshly painted, and the lawn was always trimmed. But no one ever stayed there for long. Every few months, a new family would move in, only to disappear within weeks. No goodbyes, no moving trucks, just gone. As a kid, I didn't think much of it. Houses got sold all the time, right? But looking back, it was strange. Too strange. One evening, I was walking home from a friend's house when I passed by the house. The sun had just set, and the street lights flickered on, casting a dim glow over the sidewalk. As I glanced up at the house, something made me stop in my tracks. There was a woman in the upstairs window. She stood perfectly still, facing the street. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light. Her dark hair hung loosely around her shoulders, and she didn't move, not even a little. Just stared. I felt a chill creep up my spine. The house was supposed to be empty. The last family had left weeks ago. I rushed home and told my parents what I saw. My mom just chuckled, saying maybe a new family had moved in without us noticing. My dad, on the other hand, frowned. "That house again?" he muttered under his breath. When I pressed him for answers, he just shook his head. "Forget about it, kid. Some places just aren't meant to be lived in." That night, curiosity got the best of me. The next morning, I decided to ask the local realtor, a friendly older woman who had been handling home sales in our neighborhood for years. When I brought up the house, she gave me a puzzled look. "Sweetheart, that house hasn't been sold in over 10 years. I felt my stomach drop. "But people move in all the time," I argued. "I see them." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Families rent it, but they never stay. Something always happens. They leave without a word, break their leases, refuse to talk about why. No one ever stays longer than a month. and after a while, we just stopped asking why. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation, but deep down I knew something was wrong with that house. That night, I stayed up late, staring at my bedroom window. From where I sat, I could see the upper window of the mysterious house across the street. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was no woman, that my mind had played tricks on me. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., a light flickered on in the upstairs window, and there she was, the woman, standing exactly where she had been the night before, still unmoving, still watching. I didn't sleep at all that night, and after that I never walked past that house alone again. Some neighbors bring you food, others bring nightmares. Which of these stories creeped you out the most? Have you ever had a weird neighbor? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more chilling true horror stories, hit that like button and subscribe. Stay safe and stay alert.